We both work at TrueSec, actually joined the company or was part of the company when we started up back in 2005. We were only 4 people. Today we are 330 people, roughly speaking. We are part of the international first community, TFC CERT, which has 2 special communities for incident responders. We perform a lot of, as was mentioned, 32,000 hours only 2023 with 210 major incident response engagements. Yes, we are certified here and there, and we try also to help law enforcement and help create decryptors for certain ransomware strains and so on. So we have certain amount of that kind of activities.
Yeah. But that's not what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about the ways that threat actors are leveraging default settings and your Entra ID tenant to, well, gain a foothold and start exfiltrating data and move laterally throughout the environment. And one of the main culprits is, of course, our dearly beloved Beck cases.
Yeah.
So this comes in many shapes and forms. And it's not, I mean, Beck is the correct terminology, but as we can see, or as we have seen, it doesn't necessarily revolve around email. You can do this via Teams chat, via OneDrive link, via SharePoint sharing settings, etc. So Beck is the terminology, but we do have a lot of other things going on.
This is also, we recently saw more sophisticated attacks in terms of threat actors were most probably using AI to, put a more convincing message. Actually, it was a mimic of a CEO of a company, and that CEO had a very emotional message sent to all of the employees, telling that they had to cut down, and then he was very sorry about that, and he was super emotional. And then there was an attached file. Everybody should look there to figure out what's going on with the company. Going onwards, 80% of the crowd downloaded the file, clicked the links, put credentials, got the file. 30% of those actually executed malicious content that was in that file. So just to give you some figures there.
Or you can even use traditional emails. This is an email template for, hey, you've been invited to a Microsoft team. That's all in HTML code. You just need to rewrite the links to point them towards, hey, you need to go to this link or that link. And since these tools are leveraging Microsoft infrastructure, Teams chats, OneDrive, we're effectively bypassing a lot of the security features inside of the Microsoft hemisphere.
Exactly. So it just mimics what the users are used to see, right? If it looks somehow legit, then it's probably legit. That's how a regular user would think. Tech people or people who are trained or seen this or know about this, you're not part of that statistics, right?
Token theft, usually one of the main objectives when we're talking about business email compromises, comes in all nice shapes and forms. And we've discussed a couple of them from, leveraging Microsoft infrastructure to basically attack Microsoft infrastructure. But this one was quite fun.
I guess most of you have seen this kind of thing or something similar, right? A Cloudflare protected site, you go there, let's verify you're actually human, and then you just need to click that. Now, just a question. If I just visit a website, can that website put something in my clipboard? Right? You need to be going interactive with the website for this website to get the permission to push something into your clipboard. So any clicking anywhere, any interaction with the site in terms of buttons, checkboxes, etc., will actually release the restrictions and then give the site the ability to inject things into your clipboard, which is when the user does that, they will get this instruction. This instruction simply says, you know what, to verify you're human, we just want to verify you're human, press Windows button R. Anybody remembers what that is? The run dialog box will pop up in Windows, right? And then Control V, paste, right? And then press Enter on your keyboard because you're just verifying that you're human.
It's fine. We're just making sure that you're you and you're human.
Yeah. In reality, what was executed is this. Because the line is too long, the UI will only show the last portion of it, but the first portion, MSHTA, is a binary that executes code, and the code is downloaded from that website. So this is an easy way to trick the user. Hey, can you please, pretty please, execute our code on your device? It's like, here we go.
A trained eye might identify that this site is dangerous, but just saying.
Yeah, holiday bunch. Don't go there.
But on the topic of token theft, so this is actually one of the most common attack patterns that we see today, which is the adversary in the middle. Basically, you're authenticating towards the Microsoft services, but you're doing it via a proxy agent that the threat actor has control over. So any password reset flow, any sign-in flow, that all will work, but you'll only see the threat actor proxy in front of you, and they can scrape your web pages to get the company branding just right. The only thing that will differ from the real one is the URL. And this bypasses, or, well, not an MFA bypass, but we're getting a valid MFA token. We can just reuse that as you to reach whatever resource you have access to in your tenant.
Yeah, and these things has developed a lot the last few years. So they also work asynchronously, not necessarily synchronously. You don't need to be there to interact. And then, yeah, they will spin up proxies that are in your geolocation, so you're coming from Romania or Sweden, depending on whether the user clicking it is. So it's all sorts of methods to fool our, policies and restrictions.
Yeah, and we've seen threat actors running VMs inside of Azure hosting this proxy, because if it's running inside of Azure, it's trusted when we're dealing with Microsoft infrastructure, or in AWS, or in IBM Cloud, or whatever. And the local version of an adversary in the middle.
Whenever somebody executes code, obviously on a victim machine, this is what we most probably going to end up with. So they will just harvest all sorts of information that is on that machine and its surrounding. So whatever type of credentials or access that user does have to other systems, they will just harvest that information. This has been going for ever and ever and ever. This is nothing really new under the sun, but it's
and we've seen a couple of cases where we deal with the info stealers, but the info stealer is not on the corporate hardware, right? It's not on your corporate issued laptop, but it's on your gaming computer at home, because you sometimes read the mail from your gaming computer at home. And that's not monitored by your company. But we can see in the audit logs that, hey, this token is MFA'd and it's signed.
And the way this, an evolution of this, another way of getting this to work more smoothly. I just managed to authenticate as Viktor. I just fooled him and got his credential, then got the MFA going, and so I have a full-blown session. I have my tokens going on and so on. So let's go to the next step and then join my machine, my physical machine or a VM I control, to that Entra ID, to that tenant, right? Just become a legitimate device in that tenant that user belonged to.
And if so happens, this tenant automatically onboards your Entra ID joined devices into Intune, another set of magic opens. But in this particular, the default setting for this is any user in any tenant can join as much as 50 devices. This is the default value. So I can join devices for days and days. And the interesting part about this is that the way this particular attack worked was that they tried to snoop around. Hey, which account is enabled for self-service password reset? That's because self-service password reset is not covered by any protection mechanism inside of Entra ID. You're supposed to be able to do it from anywhere in the world, from any device in the world. That's how the functionality is built. That's why that's how we're intended to use it.
Yeah.
But if I start snooping around, entering valid user IDs, I can start enumerating, hey, which types of multi-factor authentication methods are registered to this user? For instance, a cell phone number, which then can be used by a threat actor called Octo Tempest.
This is a case we handled in the beginning of 2024. As you see, the dates are actually authentic. The names are a little bit twisted. So threat actor simply did, let's start the self-service password reset. Let's go and poke with SMS codes. The threat actor behind the scenes here, Octo Tempest, as was mentioned, they are regularly using SIM swapping. It's their thing. It's their modus operandi. So they trick the user. They got the SMS code. They supply that. They change the password. Now, some of you might say, well, isn't that very brave and very visible? Yes, it is. What do you guess will happen the next day? This happens like during nighttime. The next day, the user will call service desk because the user cannot access his or her. The user will probably do his or her own self-service password reset or an assisted one, right? So everything is back to normal, and this goes totally under the radar. Yeah, for some reason, something happened. So what they did there as well is that they actually registered, as you saw, their own MFA credentials and their own phone, et cetera, et cetera.
And the next step after this is, let's join my device into Entra ID. So I'm the threat actor. I now have control over your account while you're still locked out. I will take your credentials and join my device to Entra ID. Fully getting into Intune, getting all of the nice security policies that you have in place. You know, hey, this computer got enrolled into Windows Hello for Business. Why is this important? Well, that's because even if the user then resets his or her own password after the fact that you've joined the device as that user, Windows Hello for Business is still a valid authentication method until the certificate expires or you remove the device from Entra ID. So even if you reset the password, revoke all the sessions, I can spawn a new session.
In this particular case, they also got enrolled in Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. That was one of the default policies, which was good for the customer, bad for the threat actor, because what we could see is that they clearly worked by the book in terms of, let's do a recon. Now we are an authenticated entity in that tenant. Let's go recon everything. And they just downloaded the Azure AD recon tool from GitHub and run the different whatever commandlets and generated those reports. You see roles, users, groups, licenses, tenants, subscriptions, and so on. Very classic way of doing internal recon.
Yeah, very. And we also saw that this particular desktop or laptop with this particular user was sending this information to a remote URL. Possibly selling some of this information.
Yeah. Just up to on the marketplace, Russian market, and then for sales.
So the issue with all of this is that given the things that we talked about is the device can in fact become compliant, ergo bypassing a lot of your security measures that you have in place. Oh, you need to be onboarded to MDE, you need to be on this risk level, you need to have this level of operating system. All of that will happen because the device is effectively controlled by you, but in the possession of the threat actor. It will get a primary refresh token. It becomes trusted. And as we said with Windows Hello for Business, no matter how many times you reset the password, Windows Hello for Business will still be treated as a FIDO2 compliant authentication method, allowing the threat actor to log in.
Which is, I mean, Windows Hello for Business is obviously a strong multi-factor credential, although some of people here maybe or other ways consider that as a single factor. It's just my PIN code, right? But it's actually one of the strongest authentication methods available, but also disconnects totally. It's a passwordless authentication, which is awesome for the threat actor in this case.
So enough about joining devices. This is still a thing. Anyone familiar with the terminology illicit grant consent attacks, this is what we're talking about. Because to this day, it's still 2024, but we're still seeing tenants getting triggered by this almost, not every day, but like monthly basis at least. And this means that an end user can consent with his or her credentials to his or her APIs to any enterprise application on the marketplace. You can't do an admin consent unless I were to target a specific admin to say, hey, can you please consent to this application? And the way this works is this image is kind of misinformational, but it says attacker tenant. So the attacker can actually create their own application and send the link to you and say, hey, can you please consent to this application so I can get access to your information? Yeah, sure. But it can also leverage legitimate applications. And we've seen this a bunch of times with threat actors using, well, free CRM tools. Like, hey, I want to get insights into your email. I want to start phishing other users inside of your company. And the CRM platform will happily provide me with, you know, how many links were clicked, how many opened this email, how many did this and that, all of which is being done non-interactively without the user's actual awareness of it happening.
And it's also legitimately known and does have positive credentials in terms of, do we trust this sending IP address, these sending domains, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a known application.
Yep.
Right.
It's on the marketplace. It's from a trusted publisher. This is a good application in terms of, you know, code signing and everything like that. But if a threat actor can come in from the application side and misuse it, it doesn't really matter anymore. And
that's another chapter, right? So then with enough credentials, you can actually register your own application and the victim tenant. So now we're actually standing up our own app and the victim tenant and becoming even more legitimate and even more convincing in our storyline.
Yeah.
Because you know what, this is one of our internal applications, so it should be more safe and good and cozy to just go there and do something.
Yeah. And as I written on the screen, right, if an end user can register an application, so can a threat actor. Makes sense, right? Because, I mean, you still need to compromise an account. You need to get a foothold. But once that's done and the settings are set up in this way, the door is open. So let's go ahead and create an app with like mail read all. And I will then impersonate that application or send an email via that application to another user inside of your company to start furthering my recon. And this looks something along the lines like this, that we have one user, this user got popped via phishing email, token theft or whatever, registered this application and uses the application to compromise other users. Once again, this is in user context, so the application can only read the APIs that you as a user have the permissions to actually delegate to this application. It would be even scarier if we had application delegated permissions, because then the application itself can do some scary stuff.
That's an interesting one. Everybody, when we invite other people to, interact with us, cooperate with us and our tenant, they will just get a guest user entity, right? So initially, the default configuration is that those guest users are quite powerful in terms of they don't have that much limitations. They can just do whatever a regular user can do in terms of they can enumerate.
They can enumerate, they can read, how is this tenant configured? I regularly do this when I do Entra ID health checks or security vettings of Entra ID tenants, and I'm like, just invite my guest account. I can probably figure out how your tenant is configured. And this is the way it's built by default. The good thing about this is that it can be hardened to say, no, you're a guest user. You're not allowed to read anything inside of this tenant outside of the team or OneDrive or SharePoint site that you're invited to. However, there is an attribute inside of Entra ID called user type. And if you're an admin, you can change user type on a guest entity to say, you're now a member. And if the guest user is user type member, it's not affected by these guest user settings at all. It's being treated like an internal user. It can read anything an internal user can read. So who can actually invite these people into my tenant?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, by default, anyone can, including other guest users. And on the topic of guest users, the default settings in SharePoint Online allows guests to share items they don't own. So if I'm invited to, hey, you're invited to my super secret team, you can collaborate with me inside of this team area. We can talk shit about other people. That guest user is now free to share that item or download it or do whatever he or she wants with it by default.
Yeah.
So enough about the...
Exactly. So before all this begins, before anybody does actually have an access, how much information can they get, right? There's a lot of publicly available information. And then the reason behind that is simply that, you know what, when you authenticate to, a Microsoft tenant, right, an Entra ID tenant, Microsoft needs to understand if you do have legitimate business here or not in terms of, are you actually a registered user? And no, you don't have that kind of free, let's figure the things out. It's not per tenant, it's global per Microsoft ecosystem, right? So they cannot like, oh, you know what, this email address, where does it exist? Yeah, it does exist. It does have a reach into some tenant or some tenants. We cannot tell you more details unless you actually perform an authentication, but we can start guessing things, right?
Yeah, we can ask like, this email address, does this exist in this tenant? Mm. Or in that tenant? Because that's the way the sign-in flow works, right? So if I'm invited as a guest user to another tenant, Microsoft will know about that my guest user account is actually active in this tenant. Meaning that if I target the APIs and start fiddling with this, I can actually start snooping around. Mm. Which guest users are active in your tenant? Or in your tenant? Which regular users are present in your tenant? And we can also see other services, like do you have seamless single sign-on enabled? Are you leveraging Microsoft Defender for identity? All of this unauthenticated just by poking the right API and hoping it provides us a response. Mm. So let's take a little quick look at how this can be performed. And let's pray to the gods that the demo gods are with me today. So by starters, all of the tenant IDs are there for your pleasure. You simply need to ask the correct interface or the correct URI to get a response. So yes, the tenant ID of my own demo tenant is this one. Unauthenticated, anything of the sort. We can also see which other domains are registered to this tenant. Of course, one can use other fancier tenants to actually look at stuff here. This commandlet will take a bit of time to complete. But basically what it does is that it looks for, as I mentioned earlier, are you running seamless single sign-on? Do you have federation activated on any of your domains? Are you running Microsoft Defender for identity? And all of those things. Because we're using the internet. And Microsoft happily provides us with this kind of information because it needs to be presented this way. Right, wrong, that's not my place to tell you if it is right or wrong, but it's a powerful way to gain a lot of insights into your tenant.
It is. And as said, I mean, all of these APIs and applications, the whole of the ecosystem needs to know how to get things to work, right? Viktor, if you unmaximize the ice, the screen is cutting a little bit. Yeah, things. So all of that information needs to be visible somehow, available somehow, otherwise things will start breaking. So I need to know stuff to be able to do other stuff, simply speaking.
So let's recon for some users. Does this user exist as a guest user in this tenant? Yes, it does. Does this internal user exist in this tenant? Yes, it does. Will this trigger any event in any sign-in log or audit log? No, it won't, because we're not talking to your tenant. We're talking to Microsoft. Does this user exist in this tenant? And Microsoft says, yes.
And this is actually part of the information that is globally synchronized across the sign-in service Microsoft uses. There are pieces of information that are globally available. They're just exiting your tenant and now not part of your tenant anymore, because the sign-in service needs to know how to deal with things. So you should expect the email addresses are for everybody to see and figure out whether they exist or not.
Family of client IDs. Now, these are all first-party enterprise applications. Basically, enterprise applications that you all have in your Entra ID tenants without knowing that you have them. You'll see on the list here, we have Azure PowerShell, Azure CLI, Office 365 Management, which is one of the threat actors' favorite one to leverage. But basically, what they can do with these client IDs is that I can request for an access token, saying that I want an access token for OneDrive. So I just provide this client ID, and there's no way for you to stop me trying to get an access token for OneDrive.
Well, we can filter certain things using conditional access policies, right? And other policies. But there are certain endpoints, certain applications that no, you cannot apply your conditional access policy to these guys, because if this guy doesn't work, your conditional access will not work.
Such as the self-service password reset. We can't really say, you need to be on a compliant device to do a self-service password reset. That will prevent the actual thing of having the self-service password resets operational in your tenant anyway.
Yeah.
And another one is the Microsoft Authenticator Broker, which is the one that you're leveraging when you're trying to do a self-service password reset.
This is a very popular one nowadays. Attackers simply use that to verify credentials, because they don't need to go the whole flow of, you know what, yeah, first credential is positively verified, you need to step up your MFA game and so on. You get yay or no directly when approaching this API endpoint. Either credential works or not, that's positive authentication right away. And then there are no conditional access policies, just a single factor, that's it, altogether.
And the conditional access does not apply to the authentication broker, because the way conditional access works is that conditional access is being evaluated after you have validated your credentials. So I can keep on guessing for how many times in a row as I want without ever getting triggering any conditional access policy. So what are we leveraging when we're doing these recons or snooping around externally, internally? Well, we're leveraging Azure AD Graph API, which is the old legacy API set. The termination of these APIs has been postponed like 3 times already. But the new one is that it will be destroyed, probably, in July 2025. But since it's still there, we can use it pretty much for whatever it was used for previously and do most of those things via those APIs. And if you want to find out what you really can do, some really weird stuff, you should check out our session tomorrow when we're talking about conditional access policies leveraging these APIs. So let's do a little demo on these bad boys of APIs.
Yeah, any internal recon, anything, you would need to be authenticated with your tokens ready. So.
Exactly. We need to have an access token for this particular tenant as this particular user in order to do these things. So let's construct some headers, and let's start looking around. Which users are present in this tenant? Now bear in mind, my user account that I signed in with, it's just a regular user. It's not an admin. But we're just asking the APIs, hey, give me all the users. Yes, sir, here you go. Let's see if we have any interesting things to look at in here. Basically, tenant configuration settings. That, hey, who can invite other guest users? Which role is dedicated towards all of the guest users in this tenant? Are we allowing MSOL PowerShell in this tenant? All of this as an end user. And just a little teaser for tomorrow's session. Let's look at some policies. Now, if I can do this as a regular user, Hasain can do it as a regular user, you can do it as a regular user, that means also that Octo Tempest can do it as a regular user. Provided that you know which APIs to look for and all of that, but this works. So enough about
what can be done, poking around. So the more interesting part is that how can we use this, or how can this be used or abused to laterally move from the cloud to on-prem and or different sets of escalations. Yeah, which is, I mean, all of us know we sync our passwords. Most of the tenants are syncing their passwords. Well, you sync a hash of a password, a hash of a hash, semantically, yes. Basically, the user will have the same password on-prem and in cloud. So if I got your password by phishing you with your cloud account, I can go straight ahead and use other services on-prem, which they actually do. They phish using emails, but they know exactly this is the same password, same user account, so they go access VPN or other services. Anything else that is exposed that doesn't require MFA, right? Because the users will not change that password for quite a long time. MFA might be troublesome. So wireless access, VPN access, other applications that are exposed, local SharePoint, something, exposed to internet.
And when we're dealing with, the threat actor joining the device, as I said, it gets onboarded into Intune. You get artifacts tied to on-prem resources, such as you get a VPN client. You get the certificate that you need to authenticate using the VPN client. You get line of business apps installed on your device because it's a corporate-owned device. It should have all these things, right? And it also gives you an MFA bypass due to trusted devices. And I can't stress this enough, that if you have a conditional access policy saying that you need to perform MFA, your device needs to be compliant, for the love of God, change this radio button to the top one. Don't just say require one, because that will mean that if I have a compliant device, I don't need to use MFA. Or if I use MFA, I don't need to have a compliant device. So some of the common privilege escalation paths, there are a bunch of them in the cloud. Not in the same sense of, hey, we can use Mimikatz and we can dump your credentials and we can move laterally to domain controller, because we don't have a domain controller in the cloud. But we can move laterally towards the global admin role. Application administrator. In this particular scenario, we have Alice. Alice is an app admin over my cool app, which is registered in the DefCamp tenant. Now, the service principal for my cool app is a member of the role privileged role administrator. That means that Alice, as the application, can delegate the global admin permissions to anyone else. Or another service principal. This also applies if the application itself has graph API permissions that are very privileged. Alice can then create a new service, a new client secret, reuse that service principal and just have her way. And the privileged role and privileged auth admin, well, they can directly affect global administrators in any tenant, which is why we generally recommend don't use that role. They can reset the password. They can change who is a global admin. They can reset the global admin MFA credentials and all of these things. This one is a little bit more hacky.
This is more from the on-prem side towards the cloud side, and then obviously if somebody manages to become domain admin or master server admin role or something like that, they can, if they are on the Azure Active Directory or Entra ID sync server, the server that hosts that service, they can still poke around, they can start poking around with the credentials for the sync service. And the information will be presented there, available for local admin. And so they can just grab that information and then travel from the on-prem situation to the cloud side of the things. And starting using those privileges bound to that account. Simply creating other identities, creating other applications, and so on. And
so your Entra ID Connect server is effectively a domain admin and global admin all bunched into one. Delegated admin permissions.
Delegated, the good old delegated admin permissions, right? So there are a lot of, this is not me, this is not users in my tenant. These are MSPs, service providers, partners, et cetera, licensed partners, and so on. So when my tenant was stood up, I inherited a lot of delegated admin permissions by those who helped me, or it could be a consultancy firm or something like that helping me. So they can always go and do stuff in my tenant. I will see almost nothing of that because I cannot see what's going on with that user entity. That user entity doesn't belong to me. That user entity belongs to the MSP in question. So if I would need to see what happened there, I need to get their audit logs and their sign-in logs and all of that, which I'll probably never be given.
Probably not. And we've had a couple of cases where a delegated admin permission was used to not compromise the Entra ID of the customer, but they logged on, created a bunch of really expensive virtual machines, and started mining cryptocurrencies. So that's one way to do it, and the customer is left with a hefty bill from Azure that you owe us money, but I didn't do anything. Well, yes, you did.
So this is more of a supply chain type of an attack. If you delegate that, the same thing applies for more modern style things about this, Lighthouse, MSSP type of setups, delegated access within specific, monitoring products and so on. You will also end up in the same category over here.
So we've talked about a bunch about this is stupid, this is wrong, you shouldn't be able to do this. Well, let's actually drill down into some of the mitigations you can actually take to ease your pain, letting you sleep better at night regarding these things. On the topic of client IDs, you can actually register them inside of your tenant. Like register Azure AD application, provide the client ID, and presto, you now have the possibility to say which users are supposed to sign in to this application.
Like the Azure PowerShell CLI.
Exactly. So you can actually have granular control over, okay, we know that this application exists, but we can say, user, you are explicitly the only one who can leverage this particular application in my tenant. On the topic of Privesk, converting it to GDAP from delegated admin permissions might help. However, in a number of cases we've seen, the GDAPs are overly permissioned. Basically, yeah, we're using GDAP, we're not using DAP anymore because that only has global admin or not global admin. But we're using GDAP and it has every role, effectively achieving nothing. So limit the permissions as needed by that particular MSP. Role assignments should be kept really, really restrictive, especially when we're dealing with these sensitive roles. Global admins, security admins, conditional access admins, application admins, privilege role, privilege auth admins. All of these should be really, really tightly configured, and you should have a real restrictive list on who's actually this type of role in my company.
And then, once again, logging, auditing, and monitoring what's going on in that space.
And as I said, the Entra ID Connect server, or Cloud Sync agent server, is effectively a domain controller. So treat it as a domain controller. You need to be a domain admin in order to log into the domain controller. Start working with administrative tiering and those kinds of things. As I said, with the guest users, we can actually harden this. But we need to make sure that guest users are in fact guest users. Again, auditing, logging, which guest users exist in my tenant, which user type do they have?
And also very important to have a lifecycle management approach for all of the guests we have, all of the entities we should cover with that lifecycle management aspect, but especially non-permanent access type of users or something like that.
And in terms of the external recon, if you didn't pick that up, we're using the internet. Accept the fact that you're using the internet. And you will never be 100% hidden. There's no way that we can ask Microsoft, hey, can we block this for my tenant? No. That's not how it works. Can we ask for some logs? No. You need to accept this fact. When dealing with software as a service, we're using the internet.
Exactly.
With the apps, registration, enterprise apps, well, if you're suspecting that, hey, this app is malicious, or it's used unintentionally bad, well, remove it. Revoke all of the permissions from it. Don't just let it be. Audit, 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 and remove apps no longer in use. That can actually be done rather easily from the UI itself. Just go to Usage and Insights under Enterprise Applications. It will present you a list of, these are the applications that were used in your tenant the last 30 days. If the application is not on this list, bye-bye. That's an easy way to explain it. Yes, I understand, but just to get the sense of, you have a lot of these tools readily available for you to help mitigate this particular issue.
Yeah, and then the never-ending story, obviously. Can we get rid of that phishing chapter altogether? Yeah, phishing-resistant MFA is a solution, the solution, maybe somebody would mean that. What is phishing-resistant? Well, it's key-based authentication. Remove password, go passwordless altogether. If you go Windows Hello for Business, that's passkey, that's key-based. If you go physical passkeys or passkeys that lives in your phone, whichever type of passkey, whichever type of key-based authentication is awesome, go with it. Try to remove that password thingy from your life.
And I know we said that, you can join devices and they can become compliant. Well, it still makes sense to have that as a security control, but not as the only security control. So all of these mitigations, think of them as layer of an onion. We need to have phishing-resistant auth. We need to only allow sign-ins to occur from compliant devices. We need to up the authentication strength for registering a multi-factor authentication method. By, hey, you need to use temporary access pass. There's no other way to do this. You need to have a temporary access pass. And the same goes for registering or requiring multi-factor authentication for the device join step. We can actually control this. We can tell the user that in order to join your device, you need to perform X. We can do that. So start doing it. And we can also restrict which users can join a device. By default, every user can. The more, the merrier. Join your 50 devices. I want mine. But in the portal, we can actually say, no, only this subset of users can join devices.
I mean, going back in the days, we had these kind of issues for on-prem Active Directory, and every user could join up to 5 devices freely, right? And then we discovered that was not a good practice. So nowadays, everybody's preventing that. We need to do the same thing here, right?
So in this tenant, we have configured an authentication strength called TAP, which is only leveraging temporary access pass. Only the one-time use option of temporary access pass. We can now use this authentication strength inside of our conditional access policy framework to say, if you want to register security information, you need to have a TAP. So you can't really register your own threat actor iPhone 15 Max Pro as an MFA method because you need to use a TAP. And the only way to get a TAP is by asking for it via the service desk or talking to the IT people directly with a global admin and, hey, can you issue a temporary access pass for my user? And on the device settings, we can say, users may join devices to Microsoft Entra, all selected or none. Well, we can be very selective and say, only this group of users can join devices. You need to be a member of this group, etc. Yes, I know this will interfere with Windows Autopilot and all of those things, but we need to have these layers of control. Otherwise, the threat actors are always going to find their way in. And they will, regardless of these mitigations or not. This is just a way of slowing down the threat actor to prevent them from stumbling into your environment and accidentally becoming a global admin. And this is actually a quite neat new feature. Previously, the global administrator role and the user joining the device were automatically added to the local administrator group on that particular device. We can now prevent this in the device join step. Will toggling this to no revoke all of the global admins and all of the joining users from the local admin group? No. This is a one-time thing. So if you want to control this after the device join step, you need to have an Intune policy to remove these roles and these users from these groups. And that's it for this presentation. Hasain has a bunch of stickers in his hand. That's the sticker. So if you want to have a nice sticker pretending to be someone else, please come forward and have your sticker. I don't know if we're out of time when it comes to questions, or how are we looking? 1 or 2 questions. Any questions from the audience?
First of all, a big round of applause for our speakers. Since you have the audience hooked here, raise your hands. Okay, 1 question there. The mic is on. It was supposed to be on.
Some help? Oh, there we go. So you did mention admin consent for app registration, but I didn't see it in the recommendations. Shouldn't that be enabled? It prevents users from being able to register applications or threat actors sending applications.
Can you repeat the question or keep the mic a little bit closer, please?
Sorry. Shouldn't admin consent for app registration be enabled? I didn't see it in the recommendation. It does prevent users from actually registering applications.
Absolutely. That's 100% true. Admin consent should be enabled for any enterprise application, regardless of its permission levels. And the same goes for app registrations. Normal users shouldn't be allowed to register their own applications. Only application administrators or higher. You're very correct, sir.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, 1 more question.
1, 2, okay. So in case where a user requests a new software, we can check this software in a sandbox. But how we can check the Azure applications before approve it to use for other users? And will this check be effective?
So what can be done, so what I'm getting at is that if you get, hey, I get an admin consent request for this particular application, how can I make sure that this application is valid or okay to use? Well, you need to start digging around and start looking at the application itself. Inside of Defender for Cloud Apps, you can get a lot of information of, does this application support multi-factor authentication? Does this have an audit log? Does this have X, Y, and Z? So you can start leveraging these different pieces of information to try to build yourself a correct view of, hey, is this application trustworthy or not? But at the bottom line, it's still your decision to make. Regardless of what all these checks and boxes tell you, you can never be 100% sure that this application will never be misused, right? Because we're leveraging other people's software to manage our, not manage, but reading our information. So there are tools available, but you need to go by an app-by-app basis to actually review it.
Yeah.
Trying to get some, I don't know if they will present you the source code, I highly doubt it, but...
But the low-hanging fruit here really is that, no, nobody can just consent to an application and then it's got bad, right? So there will be a lead time between I need to access this until somebody can abuse it, which will effectively terminate the abuse case quite effectively.
Okay, yes, thank you.
Lovely. We have time for one more question.
Hello.
There we go.
You mentioned a lot the auditing, alerting, and monitoring for graph APIs, app registrations, and permissions. From your experience, leveraging built-in Entra IDs solutions, what is the process in order to be able to handle, monitor, and especially see when a graph API call is made? Because I found it very difficult for companies which are also doing developing and are not using a best practice, and they are using their own tenant to assign permissions to their developers and do developing. And sometimes developers still have the client ID and secrets.
Yeah, so the issue, it depends on which set of APIs you're leveraging. So when we talked about the Azure AD APIs, you're kind of lost. There's no auditing going on internally in your tenant that will tell you this user performed this type of request towards this API. Sorry. Talking about Microsoft Graph, yes, we have those audit logs inside of the directory settings, diagnostic settings in your tenant, where we can actually look at, hey, who performed this request and when. But as you're saying, we have a bunch of tools natively available, like Defender XDR. It bunches a lot of these things into one bucket where you can actually perform these queries and look up. But there are some portions of it we're never going to see until the APIs go out of date and are actually retired, sadly.
But in terms of monitoring, actually looking from a SOC perspective, right? They will clearly see that, you know what, this user is now signing in from a different IP address altogether, and then the first thing they do, they go poke in the Graph API. The first thing they go check my applications. They check, they visit every enterprise app. So there are certain signatures to be looked at, and you will definitely find those bad guys acting.
What I've seen also difficult is, even if you have the diagnostics, if you don't have the governance P2, you'll not see the Graph API table in the log workspace.
Correct. There's even a one called, what is it called? Graph event or something like that. That only covers Microsoft Graph, but that would also incur a different cost because there's a lot of APIs calls going around. So this is as Hasain said, we do have a lot of the information needed to perform active threat hunting, We just can't see the exact API call in use or the exact client ID or token necessarily in those API logs. But we have other artifacts that we can rely upon to pretty much assume that this account was breached because we have evidence telling us that you signed in from an irregular IP address, you were using a device that is not known to us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, well, to answer your question, well, we can monitor a lot of it, but we can't have every detail because it all depends, right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.